From this recent evacuation order, we find most people aren't moving. There's simply nowhere to go. They're exhausted. There's no means of transportation. But above all, people are hungry. They're starving.
That's Liz Alcock, head of humanitarian protection at Medical Aid for Palestine, speaking from Gaza just after Israel issued orders to forcibly displace civilians in Deir al-Balah. Exhausted by their own struggles and suffering, Liz says people there have no will to move anymore under Israel's bombs and blockade.
They say to me that they would rather die quickly from a bomb or a bullet than slowly and painfully through starvation. And this, I think, is why we see people risking their lives and thousands being shot when seeking food, because they really have no other option.
Warnings of a famine and hunger over the last 20 months have become a reality when 110 people at least were killed by starving to death. But in the past week alone, these numbers have shot up alarmingly. In a single day, 10 people have died from hunger, and in 3 days, 21 children were killed by starvation. The numbers keep rising, and a full-scale famine impacting 2.2 million people looms, with more than 100 NGOs sounding the alarm. A coalition of mostly European states have also issued strong words of condemnation towards Israel's aid policy in the Strip, which has only allowed a trickle in and caused people to die fighting for grains of flour.
Every time we think we have hit rock bottom, whether that's mass forced displacement, killing and maiming, we now have an all but total siege, a militarized supply mechanism, the killing of aid seekers in their thousands, and the policy and practice of starvation.
This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. In this episode, we speak to food security and famine experts about what a famine looks like, how it impacts a population, and how this was all allowed to happen while the world watches. Israel insists there is no famine in Gaza. People online say the adults are, quote, well-fed, and yet haunting images and videos from Gaza show emaciated children crying for food, their once plump and innocent faces becoming skeletal as their parents stare at them, helpless. Journalists who have covered the war since the start say they are too exhausted to work anymore. People on the streets are collapsing. Medics treating the injured and the malnourished are themselves hungry. So why is it so difficult to, at the very least, establish that there is a famine in Gaza?
Over the years, there's become a technical definition for famine. And what happened is several years ago, a bunch of experts that focus on famine, starvation, hunger decided there isn't an agreed upon definition of famine.
This is Michael Fakhri, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food.
And so they created what's called the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. It's commonly known as the IPC. And then part of it is also what's called the Famine Review Committee. They created a technical definition, and it has 3 parts. So they look for at least 20% of the population is experiencing severe food shortage. The second point is 1 out of 3 children are acutely malnourished. And the third criteria is that at least 2 people are dying per day for every 10,000 inhabitants due to outright starvation or malnutrition and disease. Now, there's some limits to this definition. One of the limits is it depends on access to information, and Israel has been denying access to information. The second problem with this definition is it really is always going to be an underestimate. It's by design very conservative in what it's able to measure. So it's always going to be a little slow, a little behind what's actually happening on the ground. Now, this is a technical definition. From a human rights perspective, however, it's very different. We don't have to wait for this description. We don't have to wait for anyone. What we know is this: any community, when there's hunger, the first thing anyone does is they feed their children, they feed their community's children. Adults will deny themselves food for days to prioritize their children. So when communities' children start dying systemically from malnutrition, from hunger, you know there is famine, you know the social structure is under attack.
So people are dying of hunger, whether or not it's officially a famine.
There's a different term of art, which is not famine. Famine in the English language is passive. It is what happens. Starvation is actually a legal term. Starvation is a war crime that is defined, and individuals can be held liable for the crime of starvation. And that definition is broad. It's depriving civilians of objects indispensable to their survival, including willfully impeding relief supplies. So, what that means is the denial of food, water, medicine, the destruction of homes is starvation. And you don't have to measure the impact. You don't have to count dead bodies, and you don't have to measure misery to wait to find that there is starvation. By any definition, Israel has conducted a starvation campaign. But we also know there's a famine. There is a famine in Gaza. We do not have to wait. The whole point of international law and the humanitarian system is to prevent famine before it happens.
What's then the role that Hamas plays in all of this? Because we have seen unconfirmed reports that Hamas has been stealing some of the aid, but the situation is so chaotic that you don't actually know who's doing what because people are so desperate. So do you think that if it were true that Hamas was stealing the aid, that it is therefore responsible for this mass starvation, or does Israel remain responsible?
So before I address Hamas and the focus on Hamas, I'll put it into context in terms of what's happening. So Israel began its blockade against the Palestinian people in Gaza in 2000. People don't realize that it started 25 years ago. In 2007, it becomes a full military siege. So they were denying things like they disallowed the entry of pasta, coriander, wedding dresses, coffee. It was really about humiliating the Palestinian people, but they were also counting calories. If we look at Gaza in early October, or let's say September 2023, half of the people in Gaza were hungry, and 80% depended on humanitarian aid. So they were vulnerable. So then Hamas kidnaps Israeli soldiers and civilians on October 7th. And then on October 9th, Israel announces its starvation campaign. They seal off Gaza in October. From October 2023, Israel is focusing on starving people in the north to push them into the south to control people. Now let's move to more recent events. So on March 1st, Netanyahu again announces sealing off Gaza. Later on, by May 25th, we have the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is not humanitarian. That's where we are today, right? And it's all part of Israel's plan to use aid, to use food, to use starvation as one of their main tools to displace, weaken, humiliate, kill Palestinians for the grander strategy of occupation and annexation.
Assuming that Hamas is looting the aid, and this is a line that Israel has been holding on to for a very long time now. So who's responsible then for the state of starvation in Gaza?
So to your point on more specifically about Hamas, first, Israel has not provided evidence for their allegations that Hamas has been systemically looting humanitarian convoys. One. Two, what we have evidence of is Israel restricting aid, but also targeting humanitarian convoys, civilians seeking aid. And we have reports of Israel attacking UN staff and killing UN staff. And to your other point, even if we get evidence that Hamas is looting, yes, they are culpable. Yes, this violates international law. But ultimately, Israel, as the occupying force, is responsible. So what we do see are civilians on their own accord. They're so hungry that the minute the truck enters, they all, of course, go towards the truck, not allowing the truck to reach its warehouse because they're so hungry and desperate. And then UN predicted this.
Would Israel have a legal pretext to withhold or limit aid from entering Gaza under this circumstance?
No, there's no argument in international law. There are no conditions that allow for the denial of aid to civilians under any conditions, war, peace, whatever. And then it was reaffirmed by the Security Council in a Security Council resolution from 2018, in which the Security Council, whose resolutions are legally binding, reaffirmed the principle, reaffirmed the legal obligation that you cannot deny civilians humanitarian aid under any condition. There's no argument, there's no exception.
We spoke briefly about Gaza being under Israeli blockade for decades. During that time, people found ways to survive. One of those ways is farming. But Israel has decimated farmlands and restricted access to agricultural areas, particularly on the border of Gaza. Can you talk about the less straightforward, direct ways that Israel has manufactured starvation in Gaza besides depriving people from food?
People rightfully focus on the restriction and denial of humanitarian aid, but to your point, Israel has also been destroying the food system in Gaza, and that denies the Palestinian people their right to feed themselves, right? The right to grow food, to sell local food, to have local markets. Israel has been attacking the Palestinian food system since the creation of the State of Israel. I mean, that's how far that goes. And then more recently now with Gaza, we see fishers. We can't imagine life in Gaza without imagining life by the sea and eating fish. Gaza cuisine is known for its fish and seafood. Fisherfolk have been harassed and attacked by Israel for decades. They've been shot at, they've been denied entry into Palestinian territorial waters. And then what happened now is Israel decimated fishing ports, fishing boats, killing fishers, destroying their gear. They've destroyed orchards, they've destroyed greenhouses over the last 20 months. They've used weapons that in effect poison the land. They've destroyed the system of water, both for consumption and irrigation. So this is what makes it genocidal. It's denying future generations. It's making it so much harder for future generations to feed themselves, to feed each other, to live with dignity.
I've read somewhere that some cases are just beyond repair, in the sense that even if you feed some of the people that are very hungry right now, there's no chance that they're gonna heal from the state that they are in. What is the permanent effect of starving a population?
In children, if they experience acute malnutrition, if they experience starvation and famine, what happens first is what's called stunting. There's a permanent limit on then in the child's mental and physical development in the future. There's what's called wasting, where children are actually withering away. They're actually deteriorating in their family's arms. For people who survive starvation and famine, there's the long-term impacts on their health, mentally and physically. But the most profound is the social trauma. It's a trauma that lasts for generations. Because if you survive famine and starvation, you've had to make impossible decisions. You've had to decide who to feed in your family and who to deny food. If your neighbor came over and asked for food and you said, I can't give it to you, and you both survive, you both have to live with that. You've had to watch people around you die slowly from agony. You've had to watch children die from agony. And you've had to eat grass. You've had to eat things you would never consider eating before to survive. And so there's a social trauma and sometimes a sense of shame for having survived. So to ensure that the Palestinian people in Gaza and everywhere are able to live with dignity in the future is going to require a lot of work that makes sure that no matter what happens today, the Palestinian people will survive. There's no doubt in my mind about that, but that they can not just survive, but the conversation needs to be, what do they need to live with dignity?
As this abysmal reality goes on, only trickles of aid have come in, as an exception, not nearly enough to feed the hungry or reverse the effects of large-scale starvation. The aid is also not reaching all the people who need it the most, because there are just so many of them and so little of what they need. All of this while talks about a ceasefire happen in the background, where the issue of even letting aid in is among the topics of contention. I speak more about this with famine expert Alex DeWaal. He is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation. You're one of the world's leading famine experts. We understand that aid is not supposed to be weaponized at any point, and that even during wartime, civilian population cannot be starved or denied aid under any pretense. But what about ceasefire negotiations and their relationship with aid? Why is aid still being a subject of contention?
There should be absolutely no contestation, no debate about aid and essential services. It's a basic human and humanitarian requirement. It's also an obligation on Israel under international law, because last year, the International Court of Justice, in the case brought by South Africa, issued a provisional order that Israel must take all necessary and effective measures to ensure, without delay, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. Now, if Israel does not meet those requirements, it is not fulfilling its obligation to prevent genocide. And all other states that are signatories to the Genocide Convention is in danger of being complicit in not preventing genocide. So why is this not being done? I have no answer to that. The strongest rationale that Israel gives for not providing aid through the United Nations and using its own Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is that aid may fall into the hands of Hamas. And that's a legitimate concern. But everybody who has looked at what happens in a war zone, or a siege where there is hunger, knows one simple truth. The men with guns are the last ones to starve. If you pursue the path that Israel is pursuing now, you can be sure that much of that aid will end up with the men with guns, whether they are gangsters or whether they are Hamas. So the aid system that Israel has designed is the best mechanism for feeding Hamas that you could think of.
Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is, as you mentioned, killing people that it is designed or is meant to or is allegedly meant to feed. Have there been any other examples in history that we've seen where something like this GHF program was invented in place of well-established UN systems? And how did it all eventually end, if we've seen anything like it?
So we have seen systems like this before, but not in the era of the UN large-scale humanitarian operations. So, for example, the British counterinsurgency against the communists in Malaya in the 1950s, which they explicitly called Operation Starvation, had two components. One was food denial in the area that the insurgents operated, destroying all food crops, all access to food. And the second was herding people into villages, protected villages, and controlling their rations there. And for a while, it looked as though the GHF model was trying to emulate that. But it is so incompetently run, and it is being imposed in a way that makes it impossible to achieve any of those goals. At any rate, it doesn't resemble that. We've seen other cases where aid has been weaponized for forcible resettlement, for population control, etc. And over the years, the United Nations, the international humanitarian system, has brought in measures to try and really restrict and reduce that, culminating in a Security Council resolution that was passed unanimously on armed conflict and hunger. So what we're seeing in Gaza today really has no precedent in modern history.
Some people have been making the argument that mass starvation is not really happening in Gaza because, for example, the mother looks healthy, or because they saw a video of a child eating something like half a piece of bread made from rotting flour. They ask, how can there be hunger if some people seem fine?
Starvation is not the phenomenon of there not being enough food. Starvation is the phenomenon of some people not being able to eat enough food. And in pretty much every famine that one can think of, there are some people who have plenty to eat. It's a minority of people who starve. It is the most vulnerable children and the poorest, the most exposed families who are the ones who go hungry and die. And the criterion used by the UN for the threshold for when acute food insecurity crosses into famine is the threshold of 20%. So the other 80%, they may be in other states of distress. And almost always you will find some people who are absolutely fine. In fact, some people who perhaps are up even profiting from the famine.
We're talking about Gaza, where there is no real definition of a household because most people are living in tents. I don't quite know how we're still talking about a 20% threshold when there is no household.
If you follow closely the statistics on Gaza, what you see is that for the first 6 to 8 months of this current war, the data were quite good. And then the quality of the data goes off a cliff. Israel is not permitting enough aid workers in to collect the information that is required. And they're doing that quite deliberately. And secondly, with the degree of social disruption that is happening, it becomes almost impossible to generate the kind of data that we need in order to make these determinations. And so we fall back upon the older methods, the methods that were used at the time when I was first studying famine in the 80s, which can be dismissed as anecdotes because they are based upon how people are behaving, the foods they're eating, the way they are in despair, the way that society is breaking down. But just as a physician does not always need all those data from, taking blood and measuring heart rate in order to diagnose a patient. Someone who is experienced in the realities of observing or working or living in a famine situation, we know it. We can see it with our eye, and we can see it now in Gaza.
What does it look like for the future of Palestinians in Gaza when and if this blockade ends? Do you actually see a path for recovery for the people who have been starved for so long?
The biological scars will remain for the lifetime of those people who have endured it. The children who are malnourished when they are very young will not be as tall as their siblings and cousins elsewhere. They won't do as well in school. And their children will also not do so well. But the social scars will also remain. Famine is not just a biological phenomenon. Starvation is a social phenomenon. It's the phenomenon of humiliation, of shame, of societal degradation, of breaking the barriers of what is acceptable. And what I very much fear is that Gaza is at that breaking point now. And once it passes that breaking point, the numbers of children who die will go through the roof. The social chaos that we are seeing will intensify and spread, and we will find it very much more difficult to reconstitute the social fabric that existed beforehand.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. Follow developments from Gaza as they happen on thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Ben Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Du'a Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. One more thing before you go, though, we do want to hear from you. Help us improve our podcast by taking our 2-minute listener survey. You can find the link in this episode's show notes. Thank you so much for listening.